Our next speaker, I'm happy to introduce. I am married to him, and his name is Dean Theophilos. He has a master's in addiction studies and advanced studies from Hazelden Graduate School. He's a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, licensed professional clinical counselor, and is certified in dialectical behavioral therapy. He has a background in working in a faith-based addiction treatment center called Minnesota Teen Challenge, and he currently works at New Way House, which is also an addiction treatment center in St. Paul, Minnesota. So he's here to share with us about understanding the 12 steps and their Christian roots. Thank you, Dean.
Good afternoon. Thank you for all coming. So a breakdown of what kind of the plan, the agenda be for today. Kind of designing this PowerPoint, this slide, this lecture, I was kind of torn between two kind of perspectives approaching this. The one perspective, I could go on for days. There's years, really, about the theology behind the 12 steps, its history, how it came from Christian roots, the teachings behind it, how its teachings were influenced by Scripture, by Christianity, particularly ancient Christianity. But I also wanted to take this time for this lecture. I'll talk about how to actually apply the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous in one's clinical practice. One of the real cool treats that I've got experience over the past couple of years is working in the state of Minnesota, which has a very robust clinical world for treating addiction. They actually developed a model in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, of how to actually properly do treatment for people suffering with addiction, alcoholism, chemical dependency issues, whether it be an inpatient setting or an outpatient setting. So Minnesota itself, if you go to the state, really has has taken a lot of time to do work to develop a clinical setting and clinical environment to help people with addiction using the 12 steps. And particularly the work from Hazelden, the Hazelden Center for Chemical Dependency and Addiction, really spearheaded that campaign as being one of the leading chemical dependency addiction treatment centers in the country, let alone the world. So I think those two perspectives, I really want to hit this lecture on those two perspectives. A little bit about, 12 steps and their theological origin, how the 12 steps came from Christianity, came from the Scriptures, and then also how to use the 12 steps. I think a lot of times we think the 12 steps is that clinicians can't use it sometimes, that it's only preserved sometimes to go into meetings, which is true. Going to AA meetings, going to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings are so important to one's recovery. But as a clinician, whether you're a psychologist, a psychiatrist, mental health worker, you can utilize the 12 steps in your practice. So I'm going to divide the lecture as that. A little bit of brief overview of the agenda, brief overview of the teachings of Alcoholics Anonymous, their connection to Christianity, to ancient Christianity, the Scriptures, and then how to use the steps. I'll kind of go through actually how the steps are used in an inpatient facility. So if a client goes to, let's say, treatment at Hazelden, what would that look like? What steps are done? How do you work through the 12 steps in a clinical setting? So yeah, that's kind of the divide right now. And I'll try to, at least as I offer, kind of go through each step. If you have questions during, of course, the presentation, please ask. There's a mic right up here. So just go into the mic and ask the question. So I really want this to be an explanation, but also resources for you all. Again, I want to just pause a few books that are really important if you want to apply the 12 steps in clinical practice, but also in practice with Christianity too. There's some wonderful, wonderful books that are a wonderful tie-in between how to use the 12 steps and how to use the 12 steps in a Christian setting. I just want to name a few books. They're up at the front of the desk if you want to look at them. The first one is 12 Steps Christianity. It's a great, great book done by Hazelden Publishing by Saul Selby. Wonderful, wonderful book. It's a wonderful workbook. So there's questions to ask. So if you want to work through the 12 steps in a Christian using Scripture, asking questions on a very spiritual base, wonderful book to have. Of course, all these books will be listed on my PowerPoint if you want to go on Ancient Faith to look at it too. There's the 12 Steps of Spiritual Journey, another Christian book that breaks down each step, their correlations to the Scriptures, questions to ask, how to utilize it in a group setting, questions to ask if you want to, work on an individual basis. They have a book to this too, 12 Steps of Spiritual Journey. Another book that's really good is it's actually a Bible. There's a certain Bible called the Life Recovery Bible, which is the Old and New Testament with corresponding Scripture verses that go with certain steps. So you read, you have the Bible, you read it, and on the liner notes they have, this corresponds with this step, this goes with this teaching. So and there's a little workbook that comes with two, really helpful. Another book that's really good, it's more kind of an idea book, teachings behind the 12 steps. It's called Richard Ward's Breathing Underwater, The Spirituality of the 12 Steps. Richard Ward is a as a Catholic monk down in New Mexico. Just a nice little overview of the spirituality behind it. And then, of course, I am very indebted to the book of The Steps of Transformation by Father Meletios Weber, the Orthodox perspective on the 12 steps and its Christian teaching. So just resources, just to offer you guys resources to try to help you, if you want to utilize it in your own life or with the help of others in your own practice. So those are kind of the big main books. So just kind of break down the history of AA, a really brief overview. So Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the organization that created the 12 steps, began in 1935 in Akron, Ohio, with a meeting between Bill W., a New York stockbroker, and Dr. Bob S., an Akron surgeon. Both have been hopeless alcoholics, and both men had also been in contact with the Oxford Group. And I want to mention the Oxford Group particularly in this lecture because the Oxford Group is kind of the connecting piece. If you want to know how the 12 steps connected to Christianity, you got to go with the Oxford Group. And it's a wonderful, wonderful group that doesn't exist anymore, or at least not by name. But that was particularly, if you want to know where the kernel, the shell, the source of where the 12 steps gets their ideas from, it comes from the Oxford Group. But again, the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, the founders of the 12 steps were Bill W. and Dr. Bob. Their meeting helped strengthen, so they both met in 1935. Their meeting helped strengthen and maintain their sobriety, and they began to form groups helping others suffering from alcoholism. Early in 1939, the fellowship published their basic textbook, Alcoholics Anonymous. It's called The Big Book. I have right here. This is a very common book. When you go to meetings to AA, you'll be reading from this book. It's kind of like the central text of Alcoholics Anonymous, the central text of all the ideas of AA and the 12 steps, the source of its teachings. And, AA's growth was rapid. It's one of the, if you learn a little about the history of how addiction work, and particularly in the United States and in the 20th century, the 19th century, this is such a unique organization that grew so rapidly and so successfully that we have now meetings all over the world, all over the country, over to millions of members. And that's a rare thing because there were other forms of groups to try to help healing from alcoholism didn't work. And so the uniqueness of the 12 steps is very powerful. And so, it's in many ways, it's a phenomenon, a miracle in some degrees that AA, happened in the 30s, in the deep of the Depression, grew so rapidly, and now we have meetings all over the world. But the beauty of also AA is that there are many different iterations, many different groups. One of the big things that people ask me about Alcoholics Anonymous, the treatment of addiction, the 12 steps, does it just apply to alcoholism? It does not. The beauty of AA, not only did it grow with groups and more meetings, there's different types of meetings. And not just with alcoholism, but with all types of addictions. So right here I have, in the middle you have Dr. Bob and Bill W. They're the founders of AA. They're the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. But from that, AA grew to different organizations, and you see the symbols for them on here. You see the one NA, that's Narcotics Anonymous, those people who had addiction issues with hard drugs, cocaine, methamphetamines, pills. You see one right there called Al-Anon. Al-Anon was developed shortly after AA. It's groups of meetings who work the 12 steps, who are the family members, the loved ones of those suffering with addiction. So if you go to Al-Anon meetings, you can go to meetings that come together. They do 12-step work, but it's how the family copes with addiction. You see GA, Gamblers Anonymous, Alateen, meetings for the children of the people with addiction issues. You have Sexaholics Anonymous. You have Overeaters Anonymous. You have Emotions Anonymous, literally meetings with people suffering with emotions. There's text on that too. Food Addicts Anonymous, Codependent Anonymous. So I think that something gets lost sometimes. We think about AA meetings with just an AA meeting. You just go for addiction issues, alcohol. Surprisingly enough, if you go online, you search these organizations, you can find a meeting for almost any sort of issue you're struggling with. And the one other, also down there, of this big collage of pictures. See in the bottom, you see Celebrate Recovery right down there. Those are meetings for people with addiction issues that's strictly Christian-based. One of the big things I'll discuss more in this lecture is that, AA doesn't use particularly Christian language. There's no particular language of Jesus Christ. However, there was an organization that was formed called Celebrate Recovery that is Christ-based. So you go to these meetings called Celebrate Recovery meetings. They do the 12 steps, but it has Jesus as the central source of spiritual healing. Whereas AA kind of has more of a God of understanding. Different religions, different faiths can come in there to go to an AA meeting. With Celebrate Recovery meetings, you could literally, it's Christian-based, and you can go to those meetings and learn about your Christian faith while also healing from addiction issues you're struggling with. So I just keep this collage right here to remind you all about the fact that the 12 steps have been used and utilized in different settings, not just alcoholism, but other types of addiction, non-chemical dependency addictions, and then emotion addictions. Codependent Anonymous are people have codependent relationships, unhealthy relationships. So those means about how to have better relationships in your life. The next slide is some books, some basic textbooks. So the big one right here, if you go to an AA meeting, if you go to meetings, is the big book. This is the primary text of AA. This is kind of the Bible of AA. This is, you want to learn the basic teachings. This is a wonderful book, but of course there's other major big texts that you can use and people can use in recovery. Right there, there's a 12 steps and 12 traditions written by Bill W. It's also kind of the breakdown of each step. Steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The traditions of the 12 steps. I like the little black book right there, 24 hours a day. That's the daily devotional. This is a devotional that you can read every morning. So we would offer this in treatment so that, we'd have certain meditation hours during inpatient treatment where you could read a devotional, and that's one of them. That's a very primary, beautiful devotional for those in recovery. I don't have it with me, actually, but it's an amazing little book, a little devotional. The other major text book is Narcotics Anonymous. NA has their own big book. It's also a wonderful book too, written a little bit later. One thing's about the big book is that the language is somewhat antiquated. Bill W. wrote in the 30s and 40s, so its language is a little bit kind of dated. NA's big book is much more kind of modern language, a little more sometimes simplify the language. And NA has its book called NA How It Works and Why. That little green book in the top corner right there, I highly recommend that book. Wonderful, wonderful book. If you want to know how the 12 steps work, the NA book is really, really powerful and it just kind of breaks down the steps really, really well. It comes from the NA perspective, but it's just a wonderful articulation. Other books, there's the Al-Anon workbook, the big book that for people, Al-Anon, those loved ones whose the person is in addiction, how they cope and recover. They have their own devotional called Courage to Change, a wonderful little book, daily readings, every day of the year. And then another lovely little, it's not so much a devotional, but kind of a collection of sayings called As Bill Sees It. Bill W. is kind of a central member founder of AA. He wrote a lot of literature on the subject. But that book is just a collection of his writings, what he wrote about. So these are kind of basic texts. So literally a lot of people who come to treatment in Minnesota or at Hazleton, these texts were offered to them. You have to read them during treatment. Offer these texts, say you have to read these things and learn about them, write about them while you're in treatment. And they're just wonderful books in general to kind of give you a greater understanding of how the 12 steps work. And then here are the 12 steps. I'll go through each one. I'll read them aloud. So step 1, we admitted we are powerless over alcohol, that our lives become unmanageable. Step 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves can restore us to sanity. Step 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand him. Step 4, made a searching, fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Step 5, admitted to God, ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Step 6, we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Step 7, humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. Step 8, made a list of all the persons we have harmed and become willing to make amends with them. Step 9, made direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Step 10, continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Step 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understand him, praying only for the knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. Step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry the message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. So again, kind of a breakdown of the 12 steps, what they look like. One thing that's kind of important in treatment, when a client comes to inpatient treatment, ideally, if it's a treatment that's based on the 12 steps, you make sure you hit at least the first 3 steps when they come to treatment. So let's say you have someone you care about and you tell them to go to inpatient treatment, and the inpatient treatment center is 12-step based. Ideally, if they're there for say 30 days, they're going to hit the first 3 steps, 1, 2, and 3, maybe 4 and 5. And let's say they do inpatient with an outpatient treatment too, which is like they're not in a place in an inpatient setting, but like an outpatient setting for 3, 4, 5 months. By that time, you'd be hitting 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's usually how the 12 steps are applied in a clinical setting. Now, of course, if you work these steps in meetings, you can go through them in a span of a couple of days. You can go through them through a couple of months. But usually in a clinical setting, what's been done a lot in treatment facilities is that you kind of try to hit at least the first 9, but definitely in the first 7 if you do an inpatient outpatient work. So particularly today, I'm going to review kind of the first 7. Not saying that 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 aren't important, but the first 7 are kind of a lot of times when people come to treatment, they really tackle those steps particularly. So then there's the Oxford group. And this is kind of, I always go back to the correlation between the 12 steps in Christianity. This group particularly is the bridge to it. If you want to understand particularly the ideas and particularly the theology of the 12 steps, how it relates to Christianity, I strongly recommend learning and reading about the Oxford group. And right here I have this called Practice These Principles and What is the Oxford Group. Highly, highly recommend get this book. It's a wonderful book. You can buy it online by Hazelton Publishing. A link to it is in the PowerPoint. It's I'll tell you more, but it's a wonderful little book, and it shows so much of how the teachings of Christianity are part of the 12 steps teachings. So just kind of a brief overview of the Oxford group. Again, I could go on for days with this subject, but the Oxford group, founded in 1921, was a non-denominational Christian movement whose purpose was to lead individuals into dynamic, life-changing relationship with Jesus Christ. So in the 20s, there were these meetings of Christians from all different parts of denominations, parts of the world coming together to have these meetings to have a better relationship with Jesus Christ. The goal of the Oxford group was complete surrender of one's life to Christ and to live out one's faith through practical and real actions of piety. Frank Buckman, a Lutheran minister, was the founder of the Oxford group. Buckman went through his own crisis of faith, but while traveling to Europe, he attended the Kenchwick Convention in England, where his faith was reignited and inspired him to create the Oxford group. So you have this Lutheran minister, and they talk about this. There's other books about the Oxford group, but this Lutheran minister, he feels he's lost his faith, doesn't know how to regain it, and he goes to this special convention in England that's kind of like this revival meeting, and his faith is reignited, and that's what inspires him to create the Oxford group. And it's very interesting to point is that like these movements, you kind of think about what's the origin of this, is that it came from, there are these movements, especially out in Western Christianity, in the Western nations, to have these revival meetings, these meetings of people coming together, different faith backgrounds to reignite their faith. And the Keswick Convention was a Christian holiness movement which has its roots in Methodist, Wesleyan, Protestant Christianity. And I think this is really important. It's odd because people don't really realize, how is the 12 steps connected to Christianity. Well, I think if we really kind of explore, Christianity came from these Methodist, Wesleyan holiness movements. Now I can go a lot into the theology behind this, but particularly these holiness movements that occurred in the West and Western Europe and America were these movements about having Christians better live out their lives. So literally, it was just this idea that you let's say you were living in England and you want to be a better Anglican. Well, these movements were created to say, well, we want to live a better Christian walk. We want to be better Christians. And to explore more of this, the founder of Methodism and Wesleyanism was John Wesley. And there is connections between John Wesley and the Orthodox Church. John Wesley's teachings about living a deeper Christian life has its roots to Orthodox asceticism, Orthodox monastic work. He was particularly influenced by St. Ephrem the Syrian. So there's a sense so much of the Oxford group saying we wanted a group that made Christians live like first century Christians, to walk the life of ascetical life of surrendering to God. You see parallels with some of the teachings of the Oxford group with the ideas of monks amon athos, of true metanoia, of true theosis. So it's interesting that I think sometimes, a side note, a personal point is that when I was working in some faith-based communities, there were some Christians I'd work with who didn't like the 12 steps, didn't think it had anything to do with Christianity, which I find so odd because, granted, there's different Christian denominations, different theologies, but Christianity is you can see it so much shown in the 12 steps. how you act, how you behave, how you live out your life is so pivotal, so similar, so much parallels to how one walks a Christian life, one of humility, one of love for Jesus Christ. And on one side, the Oxford Group still exists. It's changed its name now to the Initiatives for Change. So the Oxford Group, of course, died out by the 30s and 40s. It was pretty much gone. But the group still exists to some degree. It's become more of a social activist group. But the origin of it definitely in the early 20s was the idea that having Christians to walk a more meaningful, more powerful life. So some basic overview of the Oxford Group. The Oxford Group had some basic principles. The first one was the 4 moral standards: absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. Those are kind of the basic ideas, that if one has joined the Oxford Group, you walk in the spirit of honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. And 4 practical steps. They talk about surrender our life, past, present, future, to God's keeping and direction. 2, sharing our sins and temptations to another Christian, and to use sharing as a witness to help others still unchanged to recognize and acknowledge their sins. Restitution to whom we have wronged directly or indirectly. And countenance, listening, accepting, and relying on God's guidance, carrying out everything we do and say, great and small. So that's kind of basic overviews. But you get this sense, again, of this reliance, this love for God, giving oneself over to God, walking this path of love, but of surrender over to God's will. That was kind of the idea of the Oxford Group, that if you go to the Oxford Group, you're going to be enveloped with God's love and guided by his path. And here's some quotes from the Oxford Group that from this book that, again, kind of particularly highlights the power of the teaching it had. So one of the ideas they had in the Oxford Group is the idea that sin was a disease. So they write this point. They say sin is a disease with consequences that we cannot foretell or judge. It is contagious as any contagious disease our bodies may suffer from. That's a very interesting point, because I think, we think about the idea of addiction as a disease. You've probably heard it before. That idea has its roots in some regards in the Oxford Group viewing sin as a disease. And particularly, I have out here Romans 7:15, which is paraphrased. I do what I do, what I hate, what I do not do, I do, what I don't want to do, what I want to do, I do not do. Kind of showing Paul's kind of addiction to the flesh to some degree. They use that text as kind of a reminder that when we're consumed by sinfulness, we're consumed by unhealthy behaviors, we can't control ourselves. We're out of control. We don't have the freedom anymore to act in a good way. So the Oxford Group really saw that, sin was a disease that we don't really have complete control over. Another quote, and he writes there, that we cannot get rid of them, the sins, by deciding to think no more about them. They may never leave us of their own accord, unless they are cut out by deciding surgical spiritual operation, which will destroy them, roots and all, set us free from their killing obsession. So that was the other point of this, is that we can't deal with this sinful behavior on ourselves. We need something greater, something more powerful to help us root it out. And I love that quote that right there, surgical spiritual operation, this removal, this outside force coming in and transforming our lives. It wasn't just our own willpower, it wasn't just thinking better to make the sin go away, but this idea that we need something outside coming in there and literally removing it from ourselves. So that idea is just really profound and important to remind ourselves about what actions are taking place here. We need to realize that this sinfulness is far beyond our control, and we need something greater in ourselves to help restore it. And then this quote, is so important in the gospel readings of "Thy will be done." That was a pivotal moment for the Oxford Group. Thy will be done. And they write, are 4 little words that give us the crux to surrendering our willpower, which is usually the last thing we wish to surrender to God. And the quote they use is from Matthew 19:26. With men, this is impossible. With God, all things are possible. So again, you get this sense right here of, to heal, we have to surrender our will over to God. To say, I can't run this show on my own. I need something else. That this is impossible with men, but with God, all things are possible. He will come in and restore us to sanity, to heal and strengthen us. And then I like this quote, too, that they talk about surrendering to God every difficulty that confronts us, each temptation, each spiritual struggle, lay them before him, either to take away or to show us their proper spiritual proportion. This idea that problems face us, we have to give them over to God, giving our problems over to God. And they actually use the idea from Luke 9 of taking up thy cross, denying himself, taking his cross and following Christ. This idea that if we're going to live a life that denies oneself and lives the walk of God, that we have to give everything up over to him, every problem over to him. So again, just to highlight this idea of healing occurs through realizing that the problem itself is much larger than we expected, much more powerful, much more baffling, much more cunning than we thought possible, and to give ourselves over to God to let his guidance heal us, restore us, strengthen us. So those ideas influence Bill W.'s writing so much. If you read the writings of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, so much of that idea that the problem is much bigger than we realized, we are not powerful enough, we need some outside help to heal us, it's influenced so much in the language of Bill W. And that reminds us so much of the Christian walk for the Oxford group, was to realize that we're going to be healed. We need to be guided by something greater than ourselves, that we can't, on our own, we're nothing. We need that outside help to inspire us, to strengthen us, to restore us. So, and I think a quote in the Big Book that's really, really important, if you read the Big Book, it's page 62, and it's this quote, I think, particularly is the meat, the real punch of what AA 12 steps are. You kind of wonder, how does one heal in 12 steps? Particularly, I think these quotes really get to how it occurs, really understands how we heal from addiction. So I want to read the quote from the Big Book. I have the quotes right up here, but I want to read the quotes from page 62 of the Big Book. It writes, selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity, we step on the toes of our fellows, and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt us, seemingly without provocation, but invariably we find that at some time in the past we have made decisions based on self, which later placed us in the position to be hurt. So our troubles, we think, are basically our own making. They arise out of ourselves. The alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, for it kills us. God makes that possible, and there often seems no way for entirely getting rid of the self without his aid. Many of us have moral and philosophical convictions galore, but we cannot live up to them even though we would have liked to. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. And I like this part. This is very pivotal. This is how and why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. Next, we decided that hereafter in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. He is the principal. We are his agents. He is the father. We are his children. Most good ideas are simple, but this concept was the keystone of the new triumphant arch through which we passed into freedom. I think what's so amazing about that quote right here is that if anyone asked you, like, what do the 12 steps do? What occurs in the 12 steps? How does it work? Well, you could ask them simply, it gets rid of your selfishness. What's the mechanism of the 12 steps? How do the 12 steps work? It gets rid of one's selfishness. When you walk the steps, the 12 steps, when you admit you're powerless, when you admit you need God's help, when you surrender your will to God, you're getting rid of your selfishness. And Bill W. points this out, that the selfishness is the root of the problems. I think a lot of times that idea gets missed because, clients come to treatment and they have all these ideas about, do I really have an addiction? Do I really, what's going on in my life? I don't agree with all this stuff. Well, let's just start simply, do you want to be more humble? Do you want to be more loving, more kind? Do you want to be less selfish? Let's start with that. That's pretty universal. And if we start with that concept, it actually can help people get through addiction better, because that's kind of the battle at stake here. The addiction itself has been ravaging the person's life, but it comes from that selfishness. And once that selfishness is removed, is let go, is surrendered over to God, healing can transform, come in, and encompass one's life with great joy and wonder. So, and again, that has its roots in Christianity. The first thing Christ mentions so much is repent. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. And that's the idea to repent, metanoia, the 180. It's realizing that we've been living a sinful life, a selfish life, a life that I'm the king of the universe. I'm the king of everything. I run the house. And Christ saying, whoa, hold on a second. That's how it works. I have a little point down here. In the early days of AA, some of the early members of AA called the group the James Club. Why? Because they felt that so much of AA's work and meetings was done from the book of James. We could go through the whole book of James, which would take forever. But, the book of James, this idea of surrendering one's will completely over to God is so pivotal, so important. And they said the book of James, So the big text that we used a lot in the early days of AA, and this is on page 4, was the Sermon on the Mount, 1 Corinthians, and the book of James. And the Sermon on the Mount particularly is considered like kind of the Christ's major teachings to the people, to early Christians. The book of James is a very practical book. If you read it, it talks about how to want to live a Christian walk. 1 Corinthians 13 particularly is a famous quote about love. What does Paul talk about? Living a life of love, living a life of repentance, love, and care. And particularly one of the major quotes for Bill W. when he created the 12 steps was James 2:20. Faith without works is dead. And that was, again, I want to pause. That's so important, because for AA to have its meat, there's a big attack on AA is that, AA is a spiritual program, and I don't like spirituality. And I could explore this subject more, but it's so important that spirituality for AA is not this believe certain dogma or believe, certain ideas. Let me convince you of how God exists and then you're okay. It's how do we live? Because that quote, faith without works is dead, was so important for Bill W. The Oxford group, the whole idea of the Oxford group that they founded was that there were all these Christians who weren't being Christians. They'd say they're Christians by name, but they weren't living it. And that was so important for Bill W. It's like, if we want to really know God, or as a Christian, if we want to know Christ, we want to understand him, who God is, we got to live it. We got to live that life to understand how faith works. Book of James is the idea that if we want to live a Christian walk, to understand how to live in a better Christian way, we have to do these actions of faith. 1 Corinthians 13, I can speak in tongues, prophesize, perform miracles. If I have not love, it's nothing. Paul's point there is that living a life of love, of Christian love, will heal and transform you. And for doing the 12 steps is that if you want to be transformed, if you want to have a deeper spiritual life, do healthy actions to heal you. If you want to say that, spirituality has transformed me, has healed me of my addiction, do those actions. Walk the walk. Don't just talk the talk. So, the next slide, we go through the 12 steps. And again, for the rest of the lecture, I just want to go particularly about, how to use the 12 steps in clinical practice. So I could go on all day about the idea about the philosophy and theology and the 12 steps, but I want to go more in particularly of how to use the 12 steps in clinical work. So if we look at the 12 steps, usually in Minnesota at least, if you go to treatment facilities that are 12-step based, ideally if a person is an inpatient with an outpatient, they do the first 7. Now, again, if you go to your own meetings and go to meetings on your own, of course, you can work the steps any way you like it. But usually, places I've worked in inpatient and outpatient, it's particularly the first 3 steps in inpatient, then 4, 5, 6, 7 in outpatient. The next slide says, we admitted we are powerless over our addiction and our lives become unmanageable. So that's the first step, powerlessness. The idea if a person wants to heal, the addict wants to heal, they have to admit that this addiction is too much for them. And, one of the ideas that you kind of wonder, if someone asks you, how do I do this first step? A very easy way to tell them is that, do the how of the program. And right now you see the word how, H-O-W. So those are 3 lovely words, and I think they're really straightforward. If someone asks you, how do I do this step? Always tell them how. Be honest. Be open-minded, be willing. Very straightforward. If you're struggling with anything, how can I be more honest? How can I be open-minded? How can I be more willing? So particularly if you go to the next page, page 5, when we're doing the first step, they come to treatment. A lot of people come to treatment and there's a spectrum. Some people come to treatment for addiction and they don't want to acknowledge. So people come to treatment, there's kind of 2 types of people, fall in 2 camps. People who really say, I ain't got no problem. Maybe I was forced to come here by court. Mom told me you got to go to treatment or you're out of the house. Yeah, that's severe. Now, some people come to treatment and they do acknowledge their power. You know what? I have an addiction. I've been in treatment before. I can't lick it. I need help. But for people who definitely don't want to admit they have addiction issues, and you see it a lot actually, people come to treatment and they're just coming here just to appease people, or they've been court ordered to come here to treatment. We do kind of call it a first step inventory. And literally the inventory is, I don't know if you can see it on the piece of paper, but literally the idea is, okay, you don't think of an addiction issue? Well, tell me about your life. Tell me how addiction has affected your life. And we go through all the categories. We say, well, how did it affect your physical health? How did it cause liver disease? Did it cause brain aneurysms? Did it cause high blood pressure because of your addiction? How much time you were spending on alcoholism? Were you going to the liquor store every single week, every day? How much money were you spending on alcoholism? We actually do the step in treatment where we say, okay, give me a number. How much money did you spend on alcoholism? How much do you spend on drugs? And we have people going into the millions. We have counselors saying, you spent over $100,000 on drugs? You could have paid off your child's college loans. You could have bought a new house. You could have saved for retirement. But no, you spend it all on addiction. You sure your life's manageable? You sure your life's going well? We say, how much did it affect your social life, your work life? How many hours did you miss jobs because you were too wasted to go to work? How many birthdays did you miss? How many anniversaries did you not go to? How many fights you get into with your loved ones because of your addiction issues? So we tell them when they come to treatment, write this all down. Give me a life story. How much did the addiction affect your life? Because a lot of people come into treatment saying, oh, no, I ain't got no problems. It's everyone else's fault. I was the victim to all of this. I didn't do anything wrong. After doing this first step, they kind of realize, oh, my gosh, here's the raw data. Here's the raw facts. Am I truly being honest with myself? This first step activity kind of reminds people to break denial. Denial's so serious when people come to treatment. They don't want to admit their problems. Now, this sounds very shaming when you, at first glance, you're like, wow, they go through all this work to show how much things are bad. And it may sound sad. A lot of times it is sad. I have people come to treatment for the first time. They're on their knees crying at the end of this worksheet. Like, I didn't realize how much my life has been affected by alcoholism. I want to spin it. It's also positive, too. Honesty should be freeing. The truth shall set you free. So if we want to be truly honest with ourselves, we got to look at, well, what's the damage of addiction? If I want to be truly honest, if I want to live a life of honesty, be true to myself, why wouldn't I want to admit that there's a huge issue in my life right now? Why wouldn't I want to admit that my relationships have been destroyed because of my alcoholism? Why do I want to live a lie? That's a big point of coming to treatment. Idea you learn how to be more honest. But again, I want to go back to the how of the program. If you ask, how do you work this step? It's honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. Honesty. Am I willing to look at all the damage my addiction caused in my life? Am I willing to fight any denial or self-justification that hides my bad behavior? So that's very important. If you're going to go to treatment to heal your addiction, if you have an addiction issue, you got to be honest with yourself. How is this affecting me? Am I really acknowledging that I'm living a life of out of control, of disaster, and do I want to get better? Open-mindedness. What have I heard in my recovery I have trouble believing? Am I willing to listen to ideas and concepts from others that I may disagree with or dislike personally? I'll get back to that point too. Again, being open-minded is so important. If I'm going to heal, if I'm going to grow, I have to be willing to listen. So if my counselor or my group or my sponsor is a big thing in AA, you got to find a sponsor that helps guide you. I'd be willing to take their guidance. If they tell me, Dean, go do these activities, I'm like, heck no way. I'm not being open-minded. I'm not working anything. It's my will again. I'm running the show. No outside help. And then being willing. And this is a big quote you maybe hear a lot in treatment. And I tell this to people, and I say it pretty seriously, are you willing to do whatever it takes to be in recovery? Now, I want to pause. That's a very, very powerful statement. Are you willing to do whatever it takes to be in recovery? Now, again, some people come to treatment and they don't think they have a problem. I'm fine. Everything's great. Oh, up to do. You got the problem. I'm wonderful. Some people say, oh, I have a problem. It's so bad. I want to change, Dean. I really want to change. I'm like, great. Let's change. But do you really want to change? Are you willing to do whatever it takes? Because it isn't just saying I have a problem. It's saying I'm willing to go to great lengths to heal myself. And let's go back to the quote from Christ that's so pivotal to the Oxford group. Take up thy cross, deny thyself, take up thy cross, and follow me. That's not do these steps, feel hunky, happy-go-lucky, rainbows and sunshine, everything's great, lovely, beautiful. It's going to be hard work, heavy, emotional, spiritual lifting. So that's very important at this point. It's the work of the 12 steps is powerful and healing. And I've seen miracles, and I've seen people cry with tears of joy, but it's also hard. These steps are not easy. And a lot of times what happens is that, remember, there's 12 of these steps. You may get the first step really well, the second step really well. You'll go to the fourth and fifth step. You're like, oh, I don't want to do that. I'll do the first three, but not the 4 and 5, or not 8 and 9. Oh, well, hold on. Wait a second. Are you willing to do whatever it takes? Whatever it takes. Not these things, but not those things. Again, that's my will. I'm running the show, not allowing God to come in, transform my life. So after they do step 1, which sometimes they come to treatment, inpatient treatment, that's all they get through is the first step. Or maybe they come to treatment, they won't even admit they're powerless. They may leave treatment and say, I still want to use. Which happens a lot. They'll come into inpatient, spend 30, 40, 50 days in treatment, go back out, use the next day. We do all this work in the first step, they don't change. That happens. But if they get to step 1, we go to step 2. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now, one thing about Hazelden that's very nice when I was doing my graduate work there is that Hazelden has spiritual counselors. So Hazelden actually does, because 12 Steps is a spiritual program, people come to treatment who aren't Christian, who don't believe in God at all, atheist, agnostic, and they help people with their understanding of God. So we actually try to help people. It's like, okay, if you want to believe of a higher power, something greater than yourselves, have some spiritual life, we'll help you understand that. And so there's chaplains at inpatient that help people have groups about, how do you understand God? And we do exercises on that. So let's say you're working with a client who's not religious. We actually do exercises where we say, okay, tell me how you understand God. Again, any faith background. But I think particularly these questions, if you look at them, the questions aren't always asking, how do you properly understand God? Because remember, the whole theology, the philosophy of AA is faith without works is dead. So AA is very big on how do you know God through your actions? To use a fancy language, it's epistemology through action. I'm going to understand God through my actions. So these questions, and I want to highlight a few. Which persons in your life have helped you have hope and for recovery? What have they done or said that convinced you of their support? The bottom one is step 1 helped you see the insanity, the consequences and behaviors of addiction. Are you beginning to get in touch with sanity, reality, a new way of thinking? Give at least 3 examples. And I like that point of this idea that when you go through recovery, you're going to make a whole change. Not just a little change, but a whole life change. Remember, metanoia, 180. The life you were as an addict is going to be very different than it is today. Don't you love those stories when you hear people, those success stories when they've changed, their whole life's gotten better, they're a better person, they have better relationships? That's a whole new life. It's literally a whole new person. A lot of questions like, what is that going to look like? What is that going to look like for you? So in step 2, when we work with clients, our big point is that what is that new life going to look like for you? Do you believe in that new life? It's going to be a while to get there, by the way. A lot of times in the media, we like to hear the success stories, and it looks very nice on screen. Like, oh, wow, that's great. Remember, I go back to it's a lot of work. So we ask clients, we want you to get to that promised land. We want you to have a happy life again. But do you believe in that happy life? Do you have the hope to walk that path? Because it ain't going to be given to you. I always say we want treatment to be like, oh, they go to treatment, everything's good now, right? No. They go to treatment, they're going to walk a path for years to help better themselves. In many ways, we don't heal until the last breath we take on this planet Earth. So I want good things to come your way. You got to have the hope that I'm going to walk that path to do that. The next page, step 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over the care of God as we understand Him. Again, this is a very spiritual question, so it's understanding what that God looks like for them in treatment. But, I definitely kind of like some of these questions particularly is explain how you made decisions in the past, list resources that you use to support yourself today, how you make decisions in the future, list 3 examples of how you've been self-centered in the past, make a list of examples of how you've been selfish in the past, and what does it mean to turn your life over to God? Particularly that question is like when we do step 3 in treatment, we kind of ask them, okay, how have you been selfish? How have you been self-centered? What are you going to turn over to God? Again, don't just say those words. Give me particular actions. So if I'm going to turn my life over to God, I'm going to say, when I feel like when I don't want to do anything over the weekend, I don't want to go to a meeting, I got to give over to God and allow myself to just do an action. A lot of times self-centeredness occurs with being preoccupied with your own self-interest, being too lazy, too angry, too bitter, too resentful. Turning over those actions to God is so important in that step. I'm going to keep going to step 4. Step 4 made a searching, fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Particularly in step 4, the big question to ask is you got to do internal exploration of yourself. You got to look at your own character defects. Okay, you've admitted you have an addiction issue. Great. Now let's look at the underlying issues behind that. Oh, you've been resentful all your life. You've been very angry all your life. So a big thing in step 4, if you go to meetings, you work with a sponsor to help you break down what are your bad character defects? What are your bad sinful behaviors? Addiction was part of it, but it's also part of depression, anger, anxiety, rude to others, bitter. On here you see a few examples of inventory worksheets, and they talk a lot about, what things to look at. And if you go to the next page on page 7, they particularly break down, if you're going to do an inventory of yourselves in step 4, they go to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 and 6. The big things that Christ mentions in the Sermon on the Mount is, are you angry? Do you have lust, sexual problems? And are you anxious? And when you do an inventory of yourselves in step 4, they ask you, how angry have you been in your life? Have you had any sexual problems in your life? And how fearful have you been in your life? How much of those played in your life? Again, if we want to heal from addiction, we got to look at those issues. People go about, I've been rude to my wife, my children. I've been rude to my friends. I've been an angry person. I've been super fearful, anxious. I don't leave the house, I'm too afraid. I've been too lazy. Or maybe I've had sexual addiction issues. Maybe I've been super resentful at people. So that you do that during treatment. And then by step 5, we admitted to God, ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Particularly, the idea is forgiveness. So let's say you do this inventory of yourselves and you look at your past and how you've been resentful and angry and spiteful and these bad mistakes you've made. And then step 5 is, well, how do you forgive yourself? So in treatment, there actually is spiritual chaplains who do step 5 work with people. So a chaplain comes in. Some of the stuff in step 5 is pretty intense. But the idea in step 5, particularly, we ask clients to be like, are you able to forgive yourself? Can you believe that God forgive you? Can you forgive yourself? What does forgiveness look like for you? And just keep moving along. Step 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Again, it goes back to this point in these steps is that if you want to transform yourself in addiction, you got to look at your character defects. You got to look at other issues in your life too. So if I want to remain sober, if I want to stay away from chemicals, I got to look at my anxiety. I got to look at my fear. I got to look at my resentments. I got to work on that every day. Hopefully, let's say someone's in recovery and they're going to meetings every day. They're working with a sponsor. They go to those meetings to work on their emotional issues. I'm looking at my depression. I'm looking at my anxiety. Ideally, you do that throughout your life. People have, let's say, 20, 30, 40 years of sobriety. They've been away from chemicals for that long. How they did it? They were working on those issues. I don't know how to deal with my anxiety. You're working on that. I don't know how to be less depressed. We're working on that too. You go to meetings to look at different ways to approach those issues. AA groups, your sponsor, your counselor to help you work on those issues. Step 7, humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings. Again, back to the idea of what does it mean to be humble. If I want to live a life of recovery, I want to deal with my anxiety in a humble way. If I want to be in recovery, I want to deal with my depression in a humble way. What does that look like? And particularly, we go back to the how to be open-minded, and willing. We're like, you got to try new ways to do it. If you want to completely follow the will of somebody else, let God guide you, you got to be willing to approach problems in a new way. I got to hear advice. Let's say, well, this is the way. Let's say you're not very good at dealing with your anger, and someone tells you, well, try this way to deal with it. And you're like, no, I don't want to do it that way. Maybe you got to learn how to communicate better. Well, I don't want to learn how to communicate better. Are you really being humble? Again, it just kind of goes back to the theme. If I want to be willing to deal with my anger, I want to try every idea possible. So if my counselor, my group tells me, hey, Dean, you got to work on communicating in this new fashion, be like, okay, yeah, I'll do it. And then just a brief overview. Again, step 8 and 9 is making amends, make a list of people we've harmed, make direct amends with them. And again, that goes back to we got to restore relationships. If we're going to walk a path of recovery, we have to heal and restore relationships. So there's questions to do with that. But I would stress that probably in treatment, when clients come to treatment, they wait on step 8 and 9 after some time of sobriety, just because you gotta be working yourself first before you try to fix other problems. And then, step 10, 11, 12, a lot of that's almost repeat work from the first 7 steps. Step 10 is about continue to take personal inventory. Well, ideally, you're taking inventory since the beginning. You keep doing that for the rest of your life. And of course, prayer is very important. If you want to have more, learning how to surrender more, you have to learn how to pray better. And then having that spiritual awakening, doing more service to others. Again, AA, the 12 steps, means that you're learning how to do kind acts of love for other people. But particularly in treatment, if you're doing outpatient treatment or inpatient, these steps are they're part of it, but they don't always hit on it immediately while you're in treatment. They wait a little bit of time. And so, yeah, that's the whole of it. I just want to close this one quote, and then we'll close it for the day. This is from the 24 Hours a Day. This is on the last page of the pamphlet. And it writes, "The prodigal son took his journey into a far country and wasted his substance on wild living. That's what we addicts do. We waste our substance with wild living. When he came to himself, he said, I will arise and go to my father. That's what you do when you come to yourself. What you do in AA when you come to yourself. Your addict self is not your real self. Your sane, sober, respectable self is your real self." Just to hit that point again is that this is a transformation of the self. When you walk a path of recovery, when you get healed by the 12 steps, you are transforming yourself into a new person. You are shedding the old self, becoming a new self, as St. Paul writes. And that's the beauty of AA. So with that, I will end. So thank you. Thank you. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but if you want to do a question up there, you can totally ask.
Thanks, Dean.
Yeah.
Can you comment on sponsors and
Yes.
how they fit in?
Yes, I mentioned it briefly. Thank you. Sponsorship is probably critical if you want to learn, I think, the idea of humility in AA, because the idea is if you have sponsorship, you're following the guidance of that sponsor. So ideally, if you go to meetings, you have to find someone who has a lot of years in sobriety. So kind of like an elder almost. Like I would almost say like a spiritual father in Orthodoxy would be someone who has years of experience in recovery, and they guide you through this path. They work through each step. Now, in treatment, if someone comes to treatment, we ask them to find one. So they'll go to meetings while in treatment. And so ideally, you work with them through each step, and you follow their guidance. I mean, it goes as much as to say, if you have someone who's guiding you, helping you on this path, you ask that person, call them every day. You say, hey, how do I deal with this issue? How do I resolve this issue? Again, teaching that idea of humility because you are learning their guidance. So particularly the sponsor helps you go through each step. They read the big book together. And particularly in the 4th and 5th step, you do your 4th and 5th step with them. So you go through an inventory with them, and then you confess your sins to them and learn how to have deep forgiveness. So again, a basic overview, but particularly with the idea of the sponsorship is supposed to deepen that humility. I mean, sometimes we ask people, like, you should be calling your sponsor, especially in your first year of recovery, at least every day. I mean, and you're asking them, hey, how do I deal with this problem today? Can I get your guidance? I have a lot of cravings today I want to use. What should I do? And ideally, you listen to that person. They should tell you, hey, do this A, B, and Z. You do it. Thank you. Yeah.
Excellent presentation. Thank you. Mine has to do with the current medical and insurance environment, because when you look at 28-day programs, sometimes it'll take people several times, to really fully recover. So in this current environment, are you seeing that the medical and insurance environment is supportive, or is it part of the challenge to get people into these programs?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, the big change now, and I don't have all the details, is that they're actually moving away from the 30-day model. So it used to be if you're going to treatment, let's say someone's with addiction, the idea is that you go to treatment for 28 days, like an inpatient facility. You're there in that building for 28 days, and then you go out. They're moving away from that, actually. And they're moving more towards an idea of doing outpatient treatment, which means like day treatment, but you actually go home to a sober house, which is like a house where there's no drugs or liquor. That model, I would say, is being scrutinized right now, but that's what it's turning towards, because I think the idea is to create an environment, like a long-term environment that supports healing. So ideally, it would be, in a perfect world, like I go to treatment and I'm involved in a community. Kind of go back to that point. I have a sponsor now. I have a meeting. I'm around healthy people. I'm doing the deal. Does that always happen? Sadly, no. So the idea is that can we create an environment that moves us, that helps to facilitate that? And I think insurance companies now, particularly in Minnesota, I have to admit the state's very good in terms of really trying to support and fund chemical dependency issues, substance use issues. They're very big on funding treatment that does outpatient treatment with supportive housing. They call it recovery residence supportive housing. And sometimes clients are in the program for a year. So you're in outpatient treatment with supportive housing for a full year, which would be great if you think about it. A full year of healthy living. You're with good, healthy people. You're staying engaged. Man, that sounds really ideal. Is it always work in practice? It's hard because it's, this stuff isn't ever easy. But I think the movement now really is, at least in Minnesota, is moving towards creating a long-term environment that really empowers you to live this walk of recovery. So thank you, guys. Thank you for coming.